Far beyond the stars, in the cold and vast expanse of the galaxy, the Drafkin Dominion ruled with an iron fist. A race of towering, battle-hardened warriors, the Drafkin were a name that struck fear into the hearts of countless civilizations. Their soldiers were unmatched in strength and strategy, their weapons more advanced than anything anyone had ever seen. For centuries, they had fought wars, conquered worlds, and expanded their empire, never once encountering a challenge they couldn't crush. Until now, Earth, a small blue planet in the farthest corner of the Milky Way, had caught the attention of the Drafkin. The first scout ship that entered Earth's atmosphere had looked upon its inhabitants with utter disdain. To the Drafkin, humanity seemed laughable, soft and weak, primitive, stuck in a world of wars fought with outdated weapons. They called the planet Softworld 23, and for the longest time, it wasn't even considered worth invading. It was simply a place where weak, insignificant creatures struggled to survive, barely even advanced enough to be considered worthy of notice. The Galactic Council, an alliance of powerful species, had long dismissed Earth as nothing more than a curiosity and unimportant world, whose human inhabitants were seen as little more than animals. The Drafkin had no interest in such a place. After all, their warriors could tear through anything the humans could throw at them. The only thing worth watching, to them, was Earth's inability to even defend itself. It was a world so helpless that it barely merited a second glance. But all that changed when the Drafkin decided to make an example out of Earth. One small, seemingly insignificant mistake, a miscommunication between their leaders, resulted in the dispatching of a small squad of elite soldiers to make an example of Earth's weakness. The squad's mission was simple: land, cause some destruction, and return to the Drafkin mothership without even breaking a sweat. The Drafkin were confident. They could crush any threat in their path without breaking a sweat. They landed in a remote area of Wyoming, expecting the humans to cower at the sight of their powerful, towering forms. They wore armor that shimmered like liquid metal, their weapons capable of turning entire cities into dust. To them, humanity's primitive military was no more threatening than a swarm of insects. As the squad set foot on Earth's soil, they couldn't help but laugh at the sight of the small, unarmed humans. They expected to find fear in the eyes of the Earthlings, but instead they found confusion and curiosity. It made no sense to the Drafkin. This world, this so-called soft world, didn't understand the gravity of their situation. But one human did. Sergeant Jacob Mercer, a man long retired from the Special Forces of the United States military, lived off the grid in the isolated wilderness of Wyoming. He had chosen a quiet life, far from the wars and chaos that defined most of humanity. For years, Jacob had lived in peace, hunting, fishing, and spending his time alone, far from the troubles of the world. But that peace was shattered when he saw the smoke rising in the distance and heard the rumbling roar of something unnatural. Curiosity led him toward the disturbance, and it was there, in the heart of the wilderness, that he encountered the first wave of the Drafkin. To say that the Drafkin were unprepared for Jacob would be an understatement. They saw him as nothing more than another weak human. A retired soldier, far removed from the battlefield. They expected him to run, to hide, or to beg for mercy like every other weak species they had encountered. But Jacob was different. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't beg. Instead, he attacked. The first Drafkin to approach him, a soldier with gleaming silver armor, was caught off guard by the ferocity and speed of the human. Jacob had lived through countless battles, trained in some of the harshest conditions on Earth, and honed his instincts to a razor's edge. The Drafkin soldier never saw the trap that Jacob had set. A well-placed explosive device sent the alien tumbling into the dirt, lifeless and motionless. The other Drafkin didn't know what to make of it. One of their own, defeated so easily by a human? It wasn't possible. And yet, there it was. The first death. They tried to regroup, but they were wrong to think they had the upper hand. Jacob was no soldier of an army, he was a lone wolf. And his mind worked differently than any alien had prepared for. Using the terrain to his advantage, he led the remaining soldiers deeper into the wilderness, drawing them into the natural traps of the land. The Drafkin, used to open fields and wide expanses of space, found themselves struggling to keep up. Their armor was heavy, their movements cumbersome, and their weapons ineffective in this unfamiliar environment. Jacob didn't care. He knew the land like the back of his hand. The more the Drafgon tried to fight, the more they underestimated the human. They expected a battle of strength, a test of who could outlast the other. What they didn't understand was that Jacob fought a different kind of war. He fought a war of the mind. By the time the Drafgon realized their mistake, it was too late. One by one, their soldiers fell. Traps, ambushes, explosives. Every move Jacob made was calculated, and each step took them further into his world, a world where humanity, despite being outmatched and outgunned, could still fight back with cunning, determination, and above all, a will to survive. The last of the Drafgon squad leader, a massive warrior with battle scars that told of centuries of combat, charged toward Jacob, his weapon humming with deadly energy. He was the Drafgon's pride, their champion. His armor was more advanced than anything the other soldiers wore, designed to withstand not only physical blows, but also energy blasts. He was the one who would teach this human the true meaning of power. But even he was not prepared for the guerrilla tactics Jacob had perfected. Using his environment, Jacob lured the warrior into a narrow gorge where the larger aliens struggled to maneuver. Jacob took the fight to him in close quarters, knowing that the alien's bulky armor made it difficult to fight in such tight spaces. Every strike, every move Jacob made was deliberate, his training, his mind, his experience against the Drafgon's might. In the end, the warrior fell. With a final, desperate roar, he collapsed to the ground and the fight was over. But as the silence settled over the battlefield, the question remained. What did it mean? The Drafgon were supposed to be unstoppable. Their soldiers were legends. Yet one human, a retired soldier with nothing but his wits and the land at his side, had single-handedly wiped out a squad of their finest warriors. The Drafgon High Council would not let this stand. They would respond. But Jacob Mercer, the man who had faced them without hesitation, would not wait. He knew what was coming next. And Earth was about to find out what it meant to fight back. The news spread across the stars like wildfire. The Drafgon, proud and ruthless conquerors, had been humiliated by a single human. Sergeant Jacob Mercer, a retired soldier living in the wilds of Wyoming, had decimated a squad of their finest warriors without breaking a sweat. To the Drafgon, this was nothing short of an insult, a challenge to their supremacy that could not be ignored. A mere human, someone so far beneath them in power, had thrown their entire military reputation into disarray. Their honor was at stake, and the Drafgon were not known for letting such insults slide. Within days, the High Command of the Drafgon Dominion sent a new strike force far more prepared, far larger and far deadlier than the last. This time, they weren't playing games. They sent an entire battalion, outfitted with advanced weapons, psychic shields, and battle tactics that no human could possibly counter. These soldiers were not the foolish, arrogant ones who'd underestimated Jacob before. They were the elite of the Drafgon military, the ones who had fought in the most brutal wars across the galaxy. They were sent to Earth with one mission, to capture or kill Jacob Mercer and make an example of him. Back on Earth, Jacob had no illusions about the gravity of the situation. He knew the Drafgon wouldn't stop until they had finished what they started. They had come to Earth once, and they would come again, stronger and more determined. The thought of a full-scale invasion was not far from his mind, and the quiet, isolated life he had enjoyed for so long was now gone. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, but he wasn't afraid. After all, he had survived countless operations, faced impossible odds, and come out on top. This was just another battle, one he had to fight alone. He spent the next few days preparing. There was no time to waste. He couldn't rely on the local authorities, not when the Drafgon were coming. They were a threat unlike any the world had seen. He had no idea how much time he had before the next wave arrived, but he wasn't going to sit around waiting for them to come to him. Jacob started by gathering what little equipment he had left. His old military gear, the same ones that had carried him through some of the deadliest battles of his life, were still in good condition. He checked his weapons, nothing fancy, Just simple tools that had saved his life time and time again. A couple of homemade grenades, a few traps he could set, and his most trusted weapon, his mind. The Drafkin would expect him to fight like a soldier, but Jacob knew better. He wasn't going to fight their way. He was going to fight his way. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing hour. Jacob could almost feel the approach of the Drafkin strike force, as if the very ground beneath his feet vibrated with the energy of their arrival. The thought of facing an entire battalion made even the most hardened soldier nervous, but not Jacob. There was no room for fear. Not anymore. The fight had already begun, and this time he wouldn't let the Drafkin have the upper hand. The first sign that the Drafkin had arrived came in the form of a low, rumbling noise. It wasn't a plane, nor was it anything Jacob had heard before. The sound was unmistakable, the sound of something far bigger, far stronger, and far more dangerous than anything on Earth. He knew they were here. The question was, how would he deal with them? Jacob didn't wait for the Drafkin to find him. He had already planned ahead. As the massive transport ship descended into the atmosphere, Jacob was already on the move. He had learned from the first encounter that the Drafkin relied too much on their brute strength. They were powerful, yes, but their arrogance and overconfidence made them predictable. He had to use that against them. He moved quickly, slipping into the dense woods that surrounded his cabin. His mind worked faster than ever, calculating the angles, setting the traps, positioning himself in places where the Drafkin would least expect him. He had the advantage of knowledge of the land, something that no alien force, no matter how advanced, could ever replicate. The Drafkin landed in force, their ships humming as they touched down with terrifying precision. Their soldiers, armored and towering, began to spread out. They had no idea that Jacob had already anticipated their every move. From the cover of the trees, Jacob watched them carefully. His heart rate was steady, his focus sharp. He wasn't going to take them all on directly, that would be suicide. Instead, he would use guerrilla tactics, the same tactics that had kept him alive in countless battles around the world. He would strike hard and then disappear into the forest before they had a chance to react. It was a game of patience and precision, and Jacob was playing it perfectly. The first trap was simple but effective. As a Drafkin soldier moved too far into the forest, Jacob triggered a hidden device, sending a burst of electricity coursing through the ground. The soldier, caught by surprise, stumbled, momentarily stunned. It was enough. Jacob darted forward, slashing his combat knife across the alien's exposed throat. The Drafkin gurgled, his eyes wide in shock, but there was no time to waste. Jacob was already moving again. The second soldier didn't fare any better. Jacob had set another trap, this one more complex, involving a series of tripwires that led to a large, heavy rock formation above. As the second soldier passed through the area, Jacob triggered the mechanism, sending a rain of rocks crashing down on the Drafkin, crushing him under their weight. The other soldiers didn't even know what had happened until it was too late. By now, the Drafkin had realized they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a single human. The element of surprise was no longer on their side, but it didn't matter. Jacob wasn't fighting fair. He was fighting smart. He knew they would respond with force, but he also knew how to use their own arrogance against them. Each move he made, each trap he set, was designed to make them doubt themselves, to make them question their superiority. The more they underestimated him, the more he took advantage. As the battle raged on, the Drafkin soldiers grew more frustrated, their once perfect strategies unraveling in the face of an enemy they could not understand. Their commander, a towering figure covered in gleaming armor, bellowed orders, but the situation was slipping out of their hands. Jacob was no longer just a nuisance. He was a force that had turned their invasion into chaos. The Drafkin were about to learn a valuable lesson. No one, not even the greatest warriors of the galaxy, could predict the mind of a human who had nothing left to lose. Jacob Mercer had become a legend. His name spread like wildfire across Earth, but not in the way anyone had ever expected. The world, once considered soft and defenseless, was now beginning to change. The Drafkin had arrived with full force, their armies landing in multiple locations across the globe, but they were no longer feared. Jacob's actions had shifted the narrative entirely. The idea that humanity was weak, that they were an easy target for conquest was starting to dissolve. The humans weren't just surviving, they were fighting back. And more importantly, they were winning. As the Drafkin began to retreat from the wilderness of Wyoming, battered and humiliated, word reached the military leaders of Earth. The response was swift. Earth had never faced such an enemy before, and no one knew exactly how to react. Governments were scrambling, unsure whether they should follow a traditional military response or rely on the unorthodox tactics Jacob had used. But Jacob had made one thing perfectly clear. This was a battle of wits, not just power. The Drafkin could have all the strength they wanted, but humans could adapt. They could use the land, their environment, and above all, their creativity to fight wars in ways the Drafkin had never dreamed of. In the wake of the first victory, Jacob was no longer just a retired soldier in the woods. He was something far more significant, a symbol. He represented the human spirit, the unyielding will to survive, and the unbreakable desire to protect what was theirs. The idea that Earth was Softworld 23 was becoming a distant memory. People began calling Earth Terra Invicta, meaning the unconquered world, a place where even the mightiest warriors could not defeat the inhabitants. This new name spread across news networks, and soon, the very concept of humanity changed in the eyes of the universe. Jacob wasn't alone anymore. His victory had sparked something. Soldiers, scientists, engineers, and ordinary citizens, all of them began working together, pooling their resources to fight the invaders. What had started as one man's resistance had evolved into a coordinated global effort. Earth's military was quickly reorganizing, and Jacob, who had originally preferred his solitary existence, found himself in the middle of something much bigger. The world needed him, and he couldn't just disappear back into the wilderness. But that didn't mean he had to lead the way the generals expected. The Earth's government reached out to him, offering him a position of power, but Jacob refused. He knew the Drafkin would return, and he couldn't afford to be tied down. Earth's armies were now mobilizing, but Jacob wasn't going to wait for them to take action. He would lead the charge, not as a military leader, but as a symbol of the new strength humanity had found. There was no time for formalities. Every day was a countdown until the Drafkin returned with more firepower, and Jacob was determined to make them regret ever thinking Earth was an easy conquest. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Drafkin were not idle. They had learned from their first encounter. Their high command seethed with anger at the humiliation they had suffered, and a new wave of reinforcements was already being readied. Their enemies had learned their ways, and that was something they could not tolerate. It was clear now, this was no longer just a conquest. It was personal. Jacob Mercer, the ghost of Softworld 23, had turned a simple invasion into an outright war, one the Drafkin had not prepared for. The Drafkin strategists now focused all their attention on Earth. They began adapting their tactics, learning from their failures. The time for direct confrontation was over. Now, they would use their superior technology to strike humanity at its heart. They planned to cripple Earth's communication systems, take down major cities, and break the spirit of the people before the full-scale invasion could begin. The next attack would be different, quicker, cleaner, and much more dangerous. But Jacob was already one step ahead. Using the intel he had gained from the previous battles, he had been gathering Earth's best minds, engineers, hackers, former soldiers, and even civilians with unique skills to prepare for the next wave. He wasn't simply defending his world, he was preparing for the war to come. Every piece of technology, every weapon, and every strategy had to be adapted to defeat the Drafkin at their own game. Jacob began training Earth's new recruits, not just in basic combat, but in guerrilla tactics, the very methods he had used to defeat the Drafkin soldiers. The humans were quick learners. They had been underestimated, and now they had a chance to prove their worth. Cities that had once been seen as weak, as easy targets, were now transformed into fortresses, fortified with traps and defensive systems that would make any invading force think twice. Jacob's influence spread like wildfire, not just among the military, but among civilians as well. Everyone knew the fight wasn't just for survival, it was for the future of humanity. And then, the Drafkin made their move. They launched their next phase of the invasion with terrifying speed. This time, they didn't arrive in scattered forces. Instead, they arrived with the full might of their fleet, dozens of battle cruisers and warships in orbit around Earth. It was a show of force unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It was clear that the Drafkin had come to finish what they started. Jacob knew this would be the real test. The human forces were ready, but how would they fare against an enemy with overwhelming firepower? Could Earth stand against the Drafkin's superior technology and vast numbers? The world held its breath as the first wave of alien ships descended upon Earth, weapons primed and ready for destruction. What the Drafkin didn't realize, however, was that their greatest mistake wasn't underestimating Earth's ability to fight back, it was underestimating Jacob Mercer. For the first time since the invasion began, the world was united. People, once divided by borders, differences, and ideologies, now stood together as one. The human spirit had risen. Earth was no longer soft. It had been forged in the fire of conflict and had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever before. As Jacob and the human forces prepared to face the Drakon head-on, the message was clear to both sides. This time, Earth would not be defeated. The sky above Earth was darker than ever before. The Drafkin's massive fleet loomed in orbit, blocking out the sun, casting long, heavy shadows over the planet. Their ships, sleek and menacing, hovered with a silent promise of destruction. The Drafkin had come, and this time, they weren't just sending a battalion, they had brought their entire armada. It was their final attempt to crush humanity, to prove once and for all that no world, no matter how small, could defy them. But they hadn't counted on one thing: humanity's resilience. For months, Jacob Mercer's victories had been the spark that ignited Earth's fight. What started as a lone man's resistance had become a worldwide movement. The humans had united under one banner, determined not to let their world fall into the hands of invaders. The leaders of Earth, once divided by petty conflicts and disagreements, now stood together with a single purpose: to protect their home. Jacob, though reluctant to take a leadership role, had become the face of this global resistance. His name was known in every corner of the Earth, whispered with reverence and hope. He had become more than just a soldier. He was now the symbol of humanity's will to survive. In the months since Jacob's first victory, Earth had undergone a dramatic transformation. The world's military forces, once disjointed and disorganized, were now a unified front. Every nation had contributed to the fight, bringing their own resources, their own strengths, to the table. New technologies, developed by Earth's brightest minds, had been tested and refined in the face of the impending invasion. Weapons once thought to be science fiction were now in the hands of soldiers who had never backed down from a fight. Every city, every country, had fortified its defenses, prepared its people, and stood ready to repel the Drafkin. But even with all this preparation, the odds still seemed insurmountable. The Drafkin fleet was vast, and their technology far surpassed anything Earth had at its disposal. Their weapons were capable of vaporizing entire cities with a single blast, and their armor was nearly impenetrable. The humans were outmatched, outgunned, and outnumbered, yet they weren't afraid. Jacob had shown them that even in the face of overwhelming odds, a single human could make a difference. And now, they were ready to fight back as a united force. The first clash came when the Drafkin launched their initial wave of attacks, targeting key military installations and major cities around the world. The skies lit up with explosions as the Drafkin unleashed their might, dropping plasma bombs on cities like New York, London, and Tokyo. The attacks were swift and brutal, designed to break the spirit of the humans before they could mount any sort of resistance. But what the Drafkin didn't expect was the strength of Earth's retaliation. Humanity's forces were ready. As the Drafkin ships descended, Earth's military responded with everything they had. Fighter jets equipped with new experimental weaponry took to the skies, engaging the Drafkin ships in fierce dogfights. The air was filled with the roar of engines, the screech of missiles, and the blinding flash of energy blasts. For every Drafkin ship that fell, humanity's forces celebrated. But for every human fighter lost, the battle grew more intense. The fight was far from over. Meanwhile, Jacob Mercer, once again in the thick of the battle, led the charge on the ground. He had become Earth's most valuable asset, his tactics and expertise invaluable to the resistance. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, he was a strategist, a leader, and a symbol of hope. He moved from one front to the next, coordinating strikes, outsmarting the Drafkin, and rallying the human forces with each victory. His presence was a beacon in the darkness, and his every move was watched with admiration by the men and women fighting alongside him. They were fighting not just for survival, but for their future, their children, and their planet. The Drafkin, meanwhile, were beginning to realize that this was no longer the easy conquest they had anticipated. They had expected humanity to crumble beneath their superior firepower, but what they found instead was a planet that refused to give up. Every battle, every attack, was met with fierce resistance. Cities were devastated, yes, but they weren't destroyed. Humanity rebuilt faster than the Drafkin could tear it down. The will of the human race was unyielding. As the war raged on, Jacob's mind was always several steps ahead. He knew that the key to victory wasn't just brute force, it was strategy. He had learned from his past battles with the Drafkin, and now he was using that knowledge to turn the tide in humanity's favor. One by one, he picked apart the Drafkin's military strategy, striking at their weakest points, sabotaging their supply lines, and disabling their most powerful weapons. Jacob was relentless. He had no time to rest, no time to mourn the losses. Every moment counted. He knew that if they didn't win this fight, the world watched as the war escalated. Major battles were fought in the skies, on the ground, and beneath the oceans. Earth's forces were spread thin, but they were determined. Every soldier, every civilian, was part of the effort. The Drafkin couldn't comprehend it, the resilience of these so-called soft-worlders. They had expected to find a planet full of weak, frightened beings, but what they encountered was something far more dangerous, a united species, willing to fight to the last man, woman, and child. Then came the moment that would change everything. After months of battle, the Drafkin decided to launch their final assault, a full-scale bombardment of Earth's major cities, aimed at wiping out any remaining resistance and breaking humanity's spirit once and for all. The countdown to their attack was set. It seemed like Earth's time had finally run out. But Jacob had one last trick up his sleeve. He had discovered the location of the Drafkin's central command ship, the vessel that controlled their entire fleet. If he could take it down, he could cripple their forces and end the invasion for good. The plan was risky, almost suicidal, but it was the only chance humanity had left. Jacob led a team of the best soldiers Earth had to offer, infiltrating the Drafkin's heavily guarded ship. The tension was unbearable as they fought their way through the ship, each step taking them closer to their target. But they couldn't stop now. Earth's future depended on this one mission. The final moments were a blur of gunfire, explosions, and chaos. As Jacob reached the heart of the Drafkin ship, he set the charges that would bring it down. With a final look at the carnage around him, he triggered the detonators, sending the central command ship into a fiery explosion. It was the blow that would cripple the Drafkin's invasion. As the Drafkin's fleet began to crumble, their forces disorganized and leaderless, humanity found its final victory. The Drafkin had underestimated Earth. They had thought the humans were weak. But in the end, it was the strength of humanity's will that won the day. The battle was over, but the war had left its scars. Earth, battered and broken, had survived, but there was no returning to the way things had been before. The sky, once filled with the glowing ships of the Drafkin, was now empty. The fleet had been decimated, their command ship destroyed in a final, fiery explosion that marked the end of their invasion. Humanity had won, but at a great cost. Entire cities lay in ruins, countless lives had been lost, and the planet would bear the marks of the war for generations to come. Yet, despite the destruction, there was a sense of hope in the air. Earth had proven something to the galaxy. Humans were not to be underestimated. Jacob Mercer, the man who had once been a simple soldier, now stood as a hero. His name would go down in history, not just as a warrior who fought in the trenches, but as the symbol of humanity's defiance. He had led the charge, not just through force, but through the power of belief. He had shown that even against impossible odds, humanity could rise, adapt, and overcome. But for Jacob, the fight was not over. The Drafkin may have been defeated, but the ripples of their invasion spread far beyond Earth. The universe had seen what humans were capable of, and it would not forget so easily. The Drafkin were not the only threat in the galaxy. Their empire, vast and sprawling, was filled with countless other races, each one capable of aggression. While Earth had fought back successfully, Jacob knew the victory was temporary. There were others out there watching, waiting to see what humanity would do next. And that was what kept Jacob awake at night. He knew that, like the Drafkin, others might look at Earth as a prize to be claimed, a world ripe for the taking. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about preparing for what came next. The universe was a dangerous place, and humanity had just made its first mark on the galactic stage. But before Jacob could focus on the future, there was the matter of rebuilding. Across the world, nations that had once been at odds with each other were now working together to pick up the pieces. The devastation was immense, but humanity's spirit was unbroken. It was in moments like these that the true strength of Earth was revealed. People who had never spoken to each other before now worked side by side, their differences forgotten in the face of a common enemy. The war had changed Earth, but it had also united it. Nations rebuilt their cities, their economies, and their governments, using what they had learned from the Drafkin invasion to create stronger defenses and better communication systems. The war had shown them that they could not afford to fight amongst themselves anymore. If they were to survive the future, they had to stand united. Jacob, however, could not stay with the rebuilding efforts forever. He had been the face of the resistance, the one who had led Earth through its darkest hour. But now, the time had come for him to step away from the spotlight. There were others who could lead, others who could guide Earth through the recovery. Jacob's role was not to govern. It was to ensure that humanity was ready for whatever came next. Earth had won, but the universe was a much larger and more dangerous place than they had ever known. He needed to prepare Earth for the long road ahead. He began training a new generation of leaders and warriors, passing on his knowledge to those who would take the mantle of defense. Jacob knew that he could not protect Earth forever. His time in the spotlight was ending, but the future of humanity depended on the next generation learning from his victories and mistakes. He built an academy, a place where humans could learn the art of survival, the tactics of war, and the importance of unity. It was a school not just for soldiers, but for thinkers, diplomats, and leaders, those who would be ready when the next threat arrived. Jacob's presence, though quieter now, was still felt everywhere. He remained a figurehead, a symbol of hope for Earth, but he was no longer the one pulling the strings. The world had changed, and so had he. He spent his days in isolation, reflecting on the war, on what Earth had lost, and what it had gained. Sometimes, he would look up at the stars and wonder if the Drafkin were the last invaders Earth would face. But deep down, he knew better. The galaxy was filled with unknowns, and Earth was no longer an insignificant world in the far corner of the universe. They had made a mark. They had sent a message that would echo across the stars. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the fallout from the Drafkin's defeat was being felt. The Drafkin Empire, once a dominant force in the cosmos, was now in disarray. Their fleet had been shattered, their command structure obliterated. But the Drafkin were not the only empire in the galaxy, and their enemies were already circling like vultures. It didn't take long for other species, watching from the shadows, to start considering their next moves. The defeat of the Drafkin was a humiliation, one that would not go unpunished. The galaxy was shifting, and Earth was at the center of it all. Jacob knew this, and it kept him awake at night. The Drafkin's defeat had been a victory, but it had also sparked something in the universe. Earth was no longer just a soft world to be conquered. It was a wild card, a force to be reckoned with. This sudden rise in humanity's stature would attract attention, and not all of it would be welcome. Jacob had always known that Earth would face challenges beyond the Drafkin, but now he could see the road ahead clearly. It would be a road filled with conflict, but also with the chance for humanity to prove that it was not just a world of survivors. It was a world of fighters. As Jacob looked out at the stars, he understood something that he hadn't before. Humanity wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for their place in the galaxy. The shift had already begun, and no matter how dangerous the path ahead might be, one thing was certain: Earth had learned the lessons of the past. It was no longer a world of soft-worlders. Earth was a world of warriors, and the universe would soon learn that humanity was not a species to be trifled with. The future of Earth was uncertain, but it was one that no one, not even the Drafkin, could ignore. Jacob Mercer had shown the galaxy the true power of humanity, the ability to rise from the ashes and fight back against impossible odds. And as Earth prepared for whatever was to come, it did so with the knowledge that they had already won the greatest battle of all, the battle for their survival. The stars were no longer a distant dream. They were a new frontier, and Earth was ready to explore them.